Welcome to Into the Fold, a books and lit faps podcast with Jael and Lin. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Jael Richardson. I'm the founder and executive director at the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD.
And I am Hudson Lin. I am your other host of Into the Fold. I am the program coordinator at the Fold.
And we're back. We're back for episode 4-ish. And we're here to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, also least favorite things to talk about, which is money.
Cha-ching.
Ching. Ching, ching.
So money, very exciting topic. It can be uncouth to talk about it sometimes.
Uncouth. That's a good word, uncouth.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an author. Did you know that?
I did know that you were an
author. But it's really important, I think, to talk about this because especially with the arts, it is something that we wouldn't be able to, the Fold wouldn't be able to exist without money, without funding. And so understanding how that works and understanding what it is that we need to do to make sure that the festival continues, I think is a very much like an insider look into the Fold. So because I am relatively new to the festival world and Jael's got tons of experience, we're going to run this particular session a little like an interview. So Jael, can you give us a high-level overview of how does funding for the arts work in Canada?
Yeah, so great to be talking about this, especially it's our 10th anniversary. We're doing this podcast to sort of like reflect on the journey across these 10 years. And so it's a good time to sort of pause and say, like, how do we actually make this possible? How do we even do what we're doing right now and record a podcast? So in terms of high level understanding of like how funding for charitable organizations work. Okay. So one of the main premises of a charitable organization is that it's not for profit. So you constantly have to prove that all the money you receive is getting spent in a given year. That's a general premise that's important. Another thing that's important in terms of funding that we sort of think about, and I remember I was trained by a woman who ran the Kingston Writers Festival, which recently announced that it was shutting down, which is an important thing to like give a shout out to that festival for what they did for me, but also acknowledge like this is what we're talking about. This is the hard stuff. So she had run that festival, Marilyn Simmons, for a while, and she had told me, you want to break your revenue, how you fund your organization, because you can always find things to spend money on. The spending is never the problem.
Never.
It's how do you get the money to be able to spend what you want.
Exactly.
And so she sort of recommended dividing it into thirds between revenue, public funding, and private funding. And so when we're talking about revenue, you're talking about ticket sales, if you have like exhibitor booths, anything, merchandise, any kind of book sales, all the things that you can bring money in for your services or for whatever you're offering at your festival. And then public funding are grants. So that's broken up into 3 levels: municipal, provincial, federal. So you can get grants on all 3 levels and you have to explain which level it is. And then private funding is sponsorships. And so that's asking companies to just give you money in exchange for, displaying their logo or giving them a certain amount of complimentary tickets or whatever the arrangement is. So those 3 levels of funding and dividing them evenly into thirds is how you're sort of encouraged to think about them. That is not how we did things at Fold. Unfortunately for us, or I guess in our mindset, we knew that revenue wasn't going to be a third. Like if you're running an organization that's a $300,000 festival, getting $100,000 in revenue is a lot, and that's difficult. So we knew we were going to have to compensate in some of the other areas. And so over time, we've probably put in like, at times, it was more like 40-40 between public and private funding and maybe 20% revenue, maybe less. And that's because of the nature of what we're doing, serving underserved communities, but also just acknowledging, some of the costs were even higher for what we were doing.
So what are the pros and cons of each type of funding? Because you mentioned with revenue, since we're a small organization, a small festival, the revenue side might not be as reliable. But for the other 2 types of funding, what are some of the pros and cons for each?
Yeah, it's interesting because running a not-for-profit and a charitable organization, for me, is one of the most stressful things I've ever done in my life. I wake up every day and my salary depends on my ability to convince someone else that what I'm doing is valuable. And as I started to hire staff, it became even more. My ability to pay my staff and myself came from my ability to convince other people that what we were doing is meaningful and valuable, and that we're doing it at the cost that it should be done at. So there's a lot of stress and anxiety for me around money, talking about money and about doing this work. One of the things that makes it really hard, especially at this time of year, so we're at the early stages of a new year, you're going into your most expensive endeavor, and you're also like haven't got all your checks from this year yet. So one of the, downsides of, I'll start with private funding, which is sponsors, is that you have to chase it constantly. So a sponsor is typically only agreeing to 1 year of sponsorship. And so you spend much of the year like setting yourself up to ask them for money, receiving the money, thanking them for the money so that you can ask them again for more money or the same amount of money. And so it's very unpredictable. A company can come and say, yes, we would like to sponsor you, and then find, oh, you know what, we actually don't have it in the budget, and just, $2,500, $5,000, $10,000 that you thought you don't have anymore. And for companies, it means honestly very little to them. $10,000 for a lot of companies isn't a ton of money, but it makes a huge difference for us. And so there's a sort of stress and anxiety about getting the money, about asking in the right way and asking for the right amount and putting it, all together in a way that's sort of impressive to them. But then there's also this nervousness of like, how long is this going to last? We were sponsored by a major company for about 7 years, like a difference-making sponsorship. Couldn't have started the festival without them. And things changed in their company and they can no longer sponsor us. And so that's caused like a huge bump for us. And it just happened suddenly. It's just one day you have it and one day you don't. On the other side, grants, when you move into a certain category, you can have multi-year funding. So you can get a grant and they'll tell you at the beginning, this is how much you're getting for the next 3 years. Every year you're going to get this amount. And that provides some like great relief, some like predictability. I can put in my budget, this is how much we're getting, and that it's coming the next year. The downside to that kind of public funding is there is so much paperwork you have to do for it. The grant applications are 20, 30 pages long. The front end budget questions and documentation are elaborate. And when you do your reporting, it's equally elaborate. So all year long, you're asking for money, and then you're doing the reports to say like you did what you said you were going to do with the money. And so I just finished a grant report that, it takes me the better part of a week to finish. I have to line up every receipt we've spent money on. And that kind of stuff is hard because you're doing so much to spend time on things that aren't actually the festival. And that can sort of take the joy away from it a little bit, especially if you're not. Like, I'm pretty A-type, pretty organized. But that kind of thing can like wear on you a little bit. Mm-hmm. And yeah. I don't know. Did that answer those things?
I think it did. Yeah. I think it also demonstrates why in larger organizations, fundraising is a full-time job.
It's a full-time job, right? Yeah. But that's the thing too. Like, we had the privilege for the last 2 years of having someone who we'll talk a little bit later about, who was able to take some of the load off of these things, because in addition to doing this, you also often have to put on events that like showcase this sponsor or showcase this funder. And so there's all these like PR type work that goes along with it that's outside of the actual work of the festival, making sure a certain person is invited, making sure they have a spot waiting for them in a certain seat, or, gets a picture taken with me or whoever, there's all these things that you have to do on top of like receiving the money. That's a lot to take in. And every person that you add to your staff as a charitable organization increases your budget exponentially. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, we could really use a full-time, all the time fund development person, but then you've got to increase your budget and increase your ask. And you're constantly weighing like, do we ask for more money just to pay for a person who's asking for the money? It's really tricky to do. Really grateful for an Ontario Trillium Foundation grant that gave us a fund development person for a while, but now it's the question of like, how do we keep that going? I'll also say one thing that's very common with literary festivals and charitable organizations are fundraising events. Mm-hmm. And funny story, when we started FOLD, we did every kind of fundraising event. So when we started FOLD, we weren't paying staff. We just wanted like $100,000 to run the festival. That's what if I recall, it was a budget around that amount. And so we were like, okay, we got to like raise some of this money because it's not all going to come from ticket sales. We haven't applied for grants yet. So we did fitness events. We did an axe throwing event. We did like bookish type events. We tried so many different fundraising efforts. And most of my literary festival friends have fundraising events that they do. The problem with fundraising events is they're just another event. You've got to get people out to them. You got to get people buying tickets. And it became like really hard to manage the needs of the festival and do fundraising events. And so I started to do like metrics for fundraising events. And you really have to measure the time, the marketing, and the money that it costs. If you want to do a gala, we've always wanted to do a gala event where we invite authors and teachers can like sit around a table and whatever. But to do a gala where you could raise $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, you have to have $15,000 minimum just to put on that event, not even the marketing for it, right? So it just became these things where it's like, we don't have the staff and we don't have the time and we probably don't even have the money to get the money we would need from that event. And so fundraising events, I just really, really encourage people to like heavily weigh their effectiveness. At one point we did a 5K. We used to do a Halloween, what was it called? The Halloween Hustle 5K. And then there was a mini Monster Mile for kids. It was really popular. It did well. It's a very good model for not a lot of money has to go in and a lot of money can come out. But it is a full, like you have to be planning that all year long. And so you need a whole team that's their whole job. And that's where we were like, no, we gotta shut that down. Yeah.
It kind of sounds like that saying where you need money to make money, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's tricky.
And my husband's entrepreneur. So I've been around like the money making model, like how you make more money and how you do things, what you cost things at. But it's very different in a charitable space, and it's very difficult to create those kinds of metrics of success. I think one of the things that's also a challenge is publishing's a tricky business, right? I don't always feel like we've got the business model down right for publishing in general. So then when you're trying to like show people the effectiveness of your event or whatever, if that business isn't measuring things the way they need to measure to see that success, they don't invest in that in the same way. So like if publishers were really clear about how much money an individual literary festival brought back to their publishing house, they could measure, okay, we always make $1,000 more in sales when we send one author. Let's invest in doing this more. But we're all not measuring those kinds of things. And so you're often convincing people who are just like, yeah, we'll do it from the goodness of our own heart to donate to the festival or sponsor and hoping that they just keep coming back year after year.
So this isn't a question that I've prepped you for in advance. So, but the way that you're describing all of this sounds very much like hat in hand going and like begging people, which is not a comfortable feeling. I think everyone would agree. So how do you deal with that personally?
Yeah, I hate it. I have great amounts of anxiety. I say all the time, I love my job. And the only thing that will like make me leave is this like financial side. I hate asking for money. I hate begging. And yet like you have to do it. We did a fundraiser before the holidays. And I remember going to an event where they said, most people don't donate because they aren't asked. And so you've got to ask. And sure enough, we asked on social media, we asked twice and like donations went up exponentially. And so then it's like, okay, I gotta keep asking. I gotta keep going on. I gotta keep asking. But I hate the feeling. I hate the feeling of trying to convince someone that something I'm so passionate about is worth their time and money. Right. I hate like when I go somewhere to a meeting with a company, a sponsor or whatever, I don't think they understand that the money I spent to get there and the money, like the time we spent to be there is like really time that we can't afford to not be doing our jobs. But we're doing it in the hopes that it turns out. And so there's sometimes times where you're just like, I hope this really works out. And you're putting a couple of our sponsors, I've gone to multiple meetings to try and convince them, only to come out with like either nothing or very little. And that kind of stuff really, like, it gets to you. It gets to your soul, and you start to think like, what's the point? There have been points where I've been like, maybe we just shouldn't do this anymore because it's too hard to like fund it and to make it work and to do it at a level, that it needs to be done, and to make sure the accessibility resources are available. Like, it's just too hard. And then I'll go to another place and people will say, oh my gosh, like, I'm so grateful for FOLD. I'm so thankful for what you guys do. And so I'm like, all right, here I go. Like, I'm put my big girl pants on and like figure this out.
Yeah.
And so that is a good challenge and a hard challenge at times. I appreciate you asking that, because it's obviously not something I like to talk about with staff. Not because I don't like to be open, but because it's like, you don't want to tell your staff it's stressful like that. But it is. I mean, I got to be honest.
And I think it's important to be honest with the team so that we can find ways to support you as well.
Yeah.
And also with like the general public, because like this is the reality.
Yeah.
And we're all about confronting or facing reality and figuring out ways to deal with it.
Yeah.
Another point of reality
Yeah.
is that sometimes funding affects programming.
Yeah.
So where we get our money from, or the ability for us to get money, hinges upon some of the programming decisions that we make. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So funding is always like tricky. And there's, some people will do the fundraising game where you're like, go and ask money that they're giving for like a new project. A lot of grants are like, we want it to be something new. We want it to be something that's like you haven't done before. And that just means you need more staff, right? Like, you're already doing what you can with the staff you have. So I really try and concentrate our endeavors around our two festivals. So we have the Festival of Literary Diversity in April, May, and then we have FOLD Kids Book Fest in November. And I really try and make sure whatever someone is funding is happening during those times, because it's the easiest way for us to sort of leverage what we already have. We already have authors coming in from out of town. We already have a budget set aside for travel, for hotels, whatever it is. So I try and be very disciplined in not creating brand new events in between the festivals because of the work level and because of the costs and those things, where if it's in August, like, we don't have any funding allocated for that activity. And so if I was going to do an activity, it would be like, you need to sponsor it for like well above what we're going to need to pay for it. Did I answer that question?
I think it was more, yes, but also like we've had an episode of the podcast on like, who do we invite and what topics do we talk about?
Yes.
And does it affect those types of decisions?
Yes. Yes, the question about programming. So yes, sometimes a sponsor will say, we want to sponsor the festival and we want it to go towards one of our authors or towards an event that includes one of our authors. I very much try not to confirm sponsors who are in that kind of position until we've actually lined up our program, so that we're not asking someone simply because we have a sponsor for it. That's not like my favorite way to do things. So I try to avoid those situations, but it can be tricky. Sometimes you are saying like, we're going to leave this spot for this publisher's author because they've sponsored this event and we want to make sure there's representation. Now, I don't have a huge problem with that, saying I'm going to leave a spot for publisher X because they have sponsored us. Because even when we ask publisher X for an author, we're asking for an author from an underrepresented community, maybe an author that they haven't traveled in another way. So we're not sitting there saying like, give us your most popular author that's been at everything that you've ever done. We're trying to think like, if it's a romance writer, maybe it's a romance writer who writes queer romance or something. You know what I mean? We're trying to like push places that often get kind of ignored or overlooked or treated like, we don't know how to deal with that from the public. So that we're using it to do what our mission sort of states.
Yeah, I think it's good to know that, because one of the concerns I think some people might have is that if we are allowing publishers to dictate who we invite, then we're operating on their definition of diversity and not ours. Yeah. right? And we want to avoid that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, ethics around sponsorship has gotten it's a big conversation, and rightfully so, right? There's this question about, oftentimes people use this term whitewashing, where companies like use their money to make something seem good when it wasn't good, when they're doing other bad things over there. I come from the mindset that all money is dirty money. I don't think there's a single dollar we get except from like the nice child down the street selling lemonade, maybe. But no, I don't think there's any money we get that isn't dirty in some way, that hasn't come through the lens of colonization, that hasn't come through capitalism, that hasn't, like, I don't believe we're getting like good, clean, green money. I think it's all dirty in some way. And my way of avoiding whitewashing is in the premise of programming and saying, like, you are welcome to sponsor us. I will take your money. Almost always. I will take your money. What I won't do is take your instructions on how to program. That's a no. I also won't take any kind of instruction about how people are allowed to speak out about the things that bother them or the things that concern them. So if somebody wants to give us money and they're doing like naughty things in their business, everybody who appears on a stage or at an event or speaking online has the right to comment on their views on that issue and their views on that company, because it's how we do better. One of the things that's really a privilege that I enjoy from sponsorships, especially public ones, is I get to sit down with people who own like major companies. Like I get to talk with people that, are involved in the decision-making of major organizations. And sometimes that's me saying, like, you got to do better. You want to sponsor us, that's great. But like, also know, like, you got to do better. And sometimes that's actually led to fundamental change. Organizations who didn't have disability representation or the kind of representation we would need in order to do our work, making changes in those areas to better serve us and to better serve their own staff. So I that's the optimism that I take into the public funding realm.
I think it's good you have this line that you're clear about.
Yeah.
So that you know what you will accept and what you won't accept.
Yeah.
I think that's important whenever we're talking about money. Because I do agree that all money is dirty money. Like our entire world our global economy is built on fundamentally exploitative system. And it's another hard reality we have to face is that even though we have very good intentions, we still exist in this world, in this system, and we have to figure out how to operate in the system in order to try to change it for the better.
Yeah, and it's like, we often think about public money as dirty money because it's coming from companies, but grant money is also dirty money. It comes from, all the things that we've done to establish ourselves as whether it's on a municipal, provincial, or a national level. So, yeah.
Okay, here's a fun question.
Oh.
If you had a magic wand and you could just wave it and like fix everything, what would you change about the way arts are funded in Canada?
So many things. I'm such a fixer. Like I think I've been involved in starting organizations because I love the idea of like building something that didn't exist before and fixing things that were broken. So these kinds of questions excite me, but also I'm like, people are like, okay, settle down. Okay, first of all, I think one of the things that's really difficult, I'm going to focus on, for this purposes, especially public funding. I probably have swapped those words. As I'm realizing now, there were a couple of times I said public, I probably meant private. You'll figure it out, listeners. But from the public standpoint, when you're applying for grants, one of the things that's really hard when you're starting and even when you're progressing is knowing what you can ask for. Like, how much is too much?
Right.
How much is like likely? And there's a lot of guessing that you do. And a lot of that guessing has long-term consequences. So I recently applied for a grant where I thought our previous amount was like 10,000 and I asked for 15,000, but I think our previous amount was 20,000. And so I had actually just like goofed it. Anyways, it's a whole thing that I'll deal with for the rest of the next 3 years. But one of the things that's very unclear when you're making your budget is like what the expectations are. And one of the things I wish that we would do is sort of establish, if you have a mid-size festival, we expect 2 to 3 staff maximum. And in saying that we would also have very clear understanding of what the minimum and maximum sort of pays for those roles should be. And I think it would be helpful for us as organizations applying. We would know, like, okay, I'm a mid-sized festival. I'm going to have 2 staff. They're each going to get paid $50K, and that's how we're going to operate. But we don't know this. So we're constantly guessing and constantly actually putting our salaries lower than they should be. I think another reason this would be helpful is because when there's inflation and there's all these things going on that are making things cost more money, granting organizations could say, we know we fund X amount of organizations with X amount of jobs under those. We need to increase all of those jobs by $5,000 a year to cover the cost of inflation. We would have metrics that make things more predictable for the organizations and more easy. I don't think that's how you say easier for the granting bodies to make improvements and changes and for lobby for improvements for changes. Because I think a lot of times the people who work on the grants and the people who work in these places know that they should be giving more. They know that there should be an increase, but they feel like, well, I don't know how to justify asking for more, you know? So I wish there were standards like that. I also wish that there was better systems for applying. So like a lot of them now have portals that are really great because it helps you track your previous applications and your asks. Some of them still operate by sending emails with attachments where you have to you switch staff. Suddenly you don't know how to find all the history on that grant. And then the last thing, is also, I wish that the reporting and the asks were more streamlined. So we were asking in the same way and getting reporting back in the same way, and that it was simplified, that we were really asking for what we actually need and not just asking for the sake of asking. If you have to do an audit and you're giving your audit, do you really have to account for every single receipt in this particular grant, or can you just show them your final audit? I don't know. These are my things. I spend a lot of time on this stuff. And so I'm constantly trying to think of what would save me money. And then I think more multi-year. Multi-year is a really, really important way to give organizations some predictability. I think, too, one thing we don't do enough is we don't understand that charitable organizations and not-for-profits, there's the big ones, right? We have massive not-for-profit and charitable organizations like World Vision or, these places that are just gigantic. But there are a lot of organizations like FOLD that are small, grassroots type places. And much like small businesses, they need support to survive. And I think when you run a small business, you can sort of say, ugh, that product isn't selling enough. I gotta change the product or improve it or decrease the price. You can do these things. With a charitable organization, it's not that simple. And so we got to figure out ways to better take care of the staff, because those are jobs, just like an entrepreneur or, a traditional staff. These are jobs that people have. And when the festivals fail because they can't get enough funding, that's a job that's lost too. And that's an effect on the economy. And it can be used to improve the economy, I think, too, right? If we are better taking care of our not-for-profits and charitable organizations, we're creating jobs just like we do when we support small businesses.
Yeah, I think that's generally the case with arts, is that it's often overlooked or undervalued, but without arts, society isn't the same.
It isn't the same. And that's the thing. We know one of the things, the great thing about the pandemic, I can't believe I started a sentence that way. But one of the great things about the pandemic is that we saw how much art helps us.
Yeah.
There is not a person who wasn't watching movies and listening to music and reading books or, putting puzzles together, whatever it was that you were doing, knitting. We know that art kept us alive through that time when so much was shut down and so much wasn't available. And I feel like we are now back to normal or whatever, and we are back to undervaluing what arts does for us. The most funded area is healthcare, and that's good and that's important. But we also don't generally realize that arts is a form of healthcare. Yeah. It's a form of taking care of our minds, its bodies, etc. And that by giving to an arts organization, you give $100 to an arts organization, it makes a big difference. You give $100 every month to an arts organization, it's a game changer. Yeah. So that's my plug. Here I am asking again. But yeah,
always asking.
Always asking. thefoldcanada.org/donate if anybody's wondering.
Okay, so we are going to ask a team member to join us today.
Ooh, I love a team member.
Sam Clarke is our volunteer and audience engagement coordinator.
We love it.
So yeah,
We're going to bring her in. We are so excited to start the second part of our conversation, which is bringing in our colleague, Samantha Clarke, who is the volunteer and audience engagement coordinator at the Fold.
Oh, thank you. So happy to be here.
Excited to have you.
Excited to have you. A lot of your job has been in the trenches with Jael, working on fund development. So can you tell us a little bit about what kind of goals you had coming into this job?
Yeah. So I remember when I first got the interview, I was like, what is this? What is the expectations of this job? But a real goal of mine was to really broaden and expand the audience of the Fold. And a huge part of that is the expansion of educators and school boards that frequent our festivals, students, attendees, all of that stuff. And within that, that really helps broaden all audience, all reach, making sure parents and teachers alike make sure they know about the Fold. And then that really plays into the reach of money too. So the higher audience you have sometimes does help with the chances of getting more funding, more relationships with sponsors, etc. So that was a huge goal.
Well, and I'll add part of this. So we were talking before about funding. So Sam's job came out of an application through the Ontario Trillium Foundation, which was they have grow grants, and you have to sort of, typically they're grow grants. This one was actually a special one after the pandemic that was really designed to help organizations get resettled and back into things. And so I can't remember the official title, but it was like a community outreach and community type of support. And the focus for us was we had done one festival after the pandemic, and it had been very difficult. The audience was much smaller. We even the costs were higher. We had to get a lot of supplies. We had to pay a nurse. We did all these things to try and make it as safe as possible. And it was like audiences had forgotten about the Fold physical festival because we had done 2 years virtual. And partners that we used to work with in person, new staff were there and didn't know who we were. And so the grant that we applied for was about making those connections again, reconnecting with schools, reconnecting with venues like PAMA, our museum, and places like that, and making those community connections that were so important to our in-person festival, which is a big part of asking sponsors for funding, et cetera. So it was a grant we got that covered 2 full years. And it's been a really valuable place because, like what Sam was saying, she had these specific targets that she was able to focus on that we often want to focus on when we're running a festival, but we're so busy applying for grants or writing reports or doing the actual inviting of the authors and executing the festival that thinking about partnerships and relationships, it falls through the cracks almost every time.
So like I mentioned, you two have been working very closely together on these grants. You've seen dozens, if not more. What are some similarities that you've come across in terms of what grantors or funders are looking for in these applications?
So usually they always ask about your mandate statement, mission, vision, mandate, and to always just connect them with the grantor's mandate as well to show that there's a connection as well. You're not just give us money, but there's no relationship there, right? So they always ask about that. They always want to know what kind of activities you're providing, what kind of outcomes that's going to come with those activities, and how you're going to fulfill those activities to match the granting requirements. Another thing they always ask for is any question about diversity. So diversity in your audience members.com, diversity within the organization, within the board, and how, again, that can fulfill the funding requirements that are being asked, because DEI is a huge component in a lot of these funding applications. So
I think too, the grants that Sam got into are a bit different than the grants we were already doing. So a lot of what Sam was applying for, she would go out and find Meridian or TD Bank or, TELUS, these companies that have these grant applications that vary in size, vary in like ask, but can bring in, you know, an additional 5, 10, 25,000, 50,000, some of them. And so she was able to put in applications for new types of grants that we hadn't done before because they're just harder to find. She spent a whole summer.
Really, yeah. And that's the thing, like just creating like a prospect list of all of these potential grantors and just applying to all of them. And they all kind of ask very similar things, which is great. So I didn't have to like bend over backwards starting from scratch with all of them. But that's kind of the basis of the questions. Yeah.
So for other arts organizations that might be out there who are also in this race with us to get granting, what do you have any advice for them about how they can be more successful in their applications?
Yeah, I think really just making sure you have a strong sponsor deck. So if you're not familiar with what a sponsor deck is, it could either be a PDF or an actual like PowerPoint slide, depending on how you want to use it. If it's in person, maybe a PowerPoint might be useful for you, or a PDF is easier for emails, obviously. But in that document, it's so important to, again, highlight your mission, vision, mandate statements, showcasing any key statistics like audience reach, social media increases, any key statistics that you're so proud of, like, here, this is what we do, and just an overview of activities as well. And then just really making sure that you're reaching out to sponsors that you have a connection with, and do your research too. Like scour the website, see keywords that they have on their website. Like if it's community building, make sure you have that word community building in your sponsor deck or in your initial email with them or something, to just making sure that you're successful. And then once that's all done, just really ensuring that you're maintaining those relationships. And I think that's a key part of my job at FOLD is, as Jael said earlier, so things don't fall through the cracks, like following up, getting them the information that they need to know, setting them follow-ups. Like, hey, this is a really cool thing that we're doing right now. You should know this. Like, you should understand that we're doing all this great stuff. So just following up with those emails too.
Yeah. And Sam is great. She'll pull like keywords on their website. And, you know, one of my strengths is I can go into a meeting, and typically what we do when we're meeting with a sponsor, or what we call like a private donor, is we'll figure out a plan that we have for them. We'll try and guesstimate like how much money they're sort of hanging on to and wanting to give out. And we'll build packages for various levels so that as they're asking questions, I can sort of soft launch an idea, get some feedback from them on like, well, yeah, maybe that, but actually we'd really like something for our clients. And so we'll try and like pitch ideas in those meetings based on what she's looked up in terms of what the company values and based on like what I know about the festival, the kinds of events that we run, the flexibility we have as a team, or the lack of flexibility sometimes we have as a team in terms of what we can offer them.
Yeah. And I think like we always ask that question is to a funder, like, what do you want? What are you looking for? It's not that we're just taking their money and that's that, but it's like, it's a relationship, it's a partnership. Like we get something, they get something as well, right? So just making sure that their needs are met as well.
And when you're running an event and you're going to see Lin, because this is coming up on your first festival, you almost have to break your festival up into as many compartments as possible. So you're going to think about like virtual events, in-person events, a meal-based event. You're going to put all these different things into like sections and value them with a certain amount of money. If someone wants to give me $5,000, this is the event that would be like worth $5,000. If someone wants to give me $10,000, well, the sign in front of the building is what we're going to give them. You know, you start to put value on everything you're doing and everything you have to see if someone will come back and like give you money. You know what I mean? Like we know, you know, if we want to keep doing this podcast next year, we're going to need someone to give us a certain amount of money, or, you know, we're going to need to figure out how to bring in that amount of money. And so everything you do, especially when it comes to sponsors and fundraising, is about trying to figure that out. And we had talked before about fundraising and events, and I will say this, as stressful as sponsorship asks are, I find that I can make as much money or more with less of my own, like of our own financial resources through a sponsorship than I can through a fundraising event. So fundraising events for me are like very low on my priority of
they're a lot of work.
They're a lot of work and a lot of money. And if it takes away from the project you're most passionate with, it just kind of ceases to be purposeful.
One thing I'm hearing from both of you is trying to like make things easier for the sponsors, like to like smooth out all of the friction, all of the road bumps, to be like, here is this very easy thing that you just need to sign onto, and it aligns with everything that you want to do.
Very important, because most times the person you're meeting with is not the person that's signing the check.
Yeah.
So 9 times out of 10, you're convincing someone that then has to go convince somebody else.
Right.
Yeah.
And so most times out of meetings, I'm going home and making like an email that includes all the things we talked about and the things I know hit home the hardest, so that they can then take that with them into their next meeting or their next pitch or their next approach. And so, yeah, you have to make it as easy as possible. You have to like update those documents, make sure they look super professional. People, I found in the early years of Fold, people looked at our logo and our designs and were like, wow, this is legit. And it was like, all we had was a logo. Like we had nothing else but a logo. Yeah. And to this day, that continues. I ran into someone recently and they were like, your branding is on point. And I don't always feel like it's on point, but I know that to people who are watching, they see us at a certain level because of that execution. And so that's always been really important to me, that things like look a certain way, because that's like sponsors will say like, they will give money to you according to what they think you're valued at, and what they think you're going to give them in terms of projecting their company out. So
and sometimes that's like an investment, like to make money, you have to spend money. So like hiring a nice graphic designer or updating, like I said, the sponsor deck that has all the information, because usually, like Jael said, you send that document to one person and then it gets sent out to like the social impact team or something, right? And so they're only just looking at that, and having high quality pictures as well, I think is huge, is a big thing. Yeah.
We use a lot of
pictures.
A lot of pictures.
There's a lot of pictures. Shout out to Herman Custodio, who's been with us since day one.
Amazing photographer.
And has done our photography every year. So it's pretty cool to see that. Yeah.
Great. So I think we'll wrap up with our top shelf question.
Ooh.
Sam, what are 3 books you would like to recommend to our listeners?
Yes. So my 3 books, so 2 of them are actually Toronto-based writers, and their books talk about venues and spaces in Toronto, which I think is really fun. So one is Sunshine Nails by Mai Nguyen, and the second one is Love Lies and Cherry Pies by Jackie Lau.
Yeah.
Then the third one is Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century by Kim Fu. So that's a
collection of short stories.
Yeah, collection of short stories. And that was actually my first short story collection that I read, and I was like, this is amazing.
Love it.
Like, such an easy read. So
love it.
Highly recommend those 3.
Amazing. Thanks. Well, listeners should go pick up all 3 books and add them to your to be read list. So one thing we mentioned really briefly earlier were individual donations. And I think sometimes they get overlooked, but individual donations, no matter how much, $5, $10, $100, can really add up. And so we would like to encourage all of our listeners to donate to The Fold at thefoldcanada.org/donate. You can give a one-time donation. You can set up monthly donations. We appreciate every single dollar that folks give to us.
I think too, like you said, like people often think of donating as these like big tasked amounts or efforts. First of all, I think, and I'll say this for Fold, but I'll also say this for the places and organizations that mean the most to you. If there are places in which you think, I could not do X without this group, become a monthly donor. Whether it's Fold or somebody else, really say, this is so important, I want to make sure it lasts. Because I guarantee you, most of those organizations could use your support. And if you can afford it, it's a really helpful, tangible way to sort of say, I want to be with you, doing this thing with you, in the trenches, as we say. I think another thing for Fold, we have a patron pass program. So as the festival comes about, if you are in a good position financially, you can donate a pass to those who can't afford it. And we have people who just request passes and we just give it to them, hoping that always balances out. And it typically does, but we have to ask. And so there's the Patron Pass program. We also have cool incentives that are going to be happening over the next few months leading up to the festival. So you'll see the shirts that Lynn and I have on are part of an anniversary book box. At the time of recording, there were not many left. So depending on when you hear this or see this, good luck. If you missed the boat, there will be some other things that may come available or things that you'll be able to check out later as we get closer to the festival. And the best way to keep up with that is to subscribe to our newsletter. Another thing I will say that's really easy. So, but all these things are financially based, right? So we've shared everything that we've talked about pretty much is about giving us some of your money. But there is also just sharing things on social media and sharing things with friends, that letting people know. If you are a teacher, you don't work for a company, but you have a spouse or a friend or a family member who's part of a company that they have a sponsorship arm to it, just passing the word along, sharing a name with an organization that's looking for funding is really, really helpful. So those kinds of quiet but powerful efforts are really useful too.
Yeah.
We're trying to hit 10,000 followers on Instagram. So
we're almost there.
And follow us.
We're also doing 10K for 10 years.
Yes.
Which is our hoping to raise $10,000 for our 10th anniversary. So there's that as well. All right, all this money.
That's great.
Let's
So thank you so much. We can wrap things up now. We've asked enough. I told you I do not like asking for money, and yet in the last 45 minutes to 50 minutes, I've asked for it 7 different times. So I am super uncomfortable, and I'm going to close off this podcast. But keep an eye out for the next episode, which will be coming out in the next month or so. We're sort of doing them every month. So you're going to see this one in February, and we'll have another one out in March. We'll be talking in that one about in-person and virtual programming. So I'm super excited about that conversation. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast feed, watch these on YouTube. If you've watched them before, watch them again. Great. And that's my main remarks. Did you have anything you want to share?
So the Festival of Literary Diversity is a multimodal festival that will run from April 27th to May 4th of 2025. You can join the festival anywhere in the world from April 27th to April 30th at our virtual events. And then in Brampton, in downtown Brampton, from May 1st to the 4th. And that's all for this episode. We will see you next time on Into the Fold with Jael and Lin.